Coriolanus Snow is the main antagonist in the Hunger Games trilogy. We got more information and insights in his character through his own prequel book and movie, The Ballad of the Songbirds and Snakes. However, the film adaptation overlooked some parts of Snow's character, and in today's video, I gathered 10 forgotten facts about Coriolanus Snow. Before getting into it though, spoiler warning for the book, and with that, let's get started. Number 10. Snow became an apprentice game maker before becoming president. This is a fact that I don't see many fans mention, mainly because they usually think of Snow as a president, and a lot tend to forget that he was actually a game maker first. The Ballad of the Songbirds and Snakes movie tries to hint on this at the ending, as Snow studies under the head game maker at the time, or Dr. Gaul. Dr. Gaul became Snow's mentor for years in the book, and it led him to be an intern as a game maker. In the book and movie of The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, we see Snow give suggestions to improve the Hunger Games, like through bets and sponsors to engage the capital citizens. Dr. Gaul loved Snow's proposal, and his creativity soon landed him a job as a game maker before he became president. Number 9. Snow disliked his father. One thing I noticed about the Hunger Games films is the fact that they don't talk about Snow's parents that much. They tried to highlight his relationship with his cousin Tigris and his grandmother, but that's pretty much it. However, the Ballad of the Songbirds and Snakes book sheds more light on Snow's parents, especially about Snow's father. In Chapter 3 of the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, Snow thinks about his father as this strict and remote man. Snow also knows how he never had great love for his father, but he felt protected by him because of the Snow status in the capital. Snow's father's death was said to leave Coriolanus with a fear and a vulnerability that he had never been able to shake off. Ultimately, Snow never loved or liked his dad, but liked the fact that his dad gave his family status and riches. Number 8. Snow could have had a sister. Added to what I mentioned earlier about the lack of Snow's family information in the movies, a pretty important detail was how Snow could have had a sister. Unlike his relationship with his father, Snow actually loved his mother. He even kept her compact mirror with him in the book to remember her and how it felt like to be loved. As Snow recalled his mother once in the Ballad of the Songbirds and Snakes, he remembered his mother's death as well. Snow reveals that his mother and the daughter she was expecting both died in childbirth. It's a really heartbreaking moment, and Snow even wonders what could have been if they had survived. The movie did mention this once when Snow was talking to Lucy Gray, but it didn't really show how much it affected Snow compared to the book, which is why it gets overlooked by fans as well. Number 7. Snow thought of the districts as other creatures. Now, this is something I barely see in the movie version of The Ballad of the Songbirds and Snakes. The Hunger Games trilogy movies seem to hint on this because Snow was anti-district so many times, but it actually started even in The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. The first instance I noticed this was when Snow was talking about Lucy Gray Baird, or his tribute in the 10th Hunger Games. When Snow is slowly falling for Lucy Gray, he thinks to himself that she isn't like the rest of the tributes. In his words in The Ballad of the Songbirds and Snakes, but Lucy Gray was his tribute, headed into the arena. And even if the circumstances were different, she'd still be a girl from the districts, or at least not capital. A second-class citizen. Human, but bestial. Smart perhaps, but not evolved. Part of a shapeless mass of unfortunate, barbaric creatures that hovered on the periphery of his consciousness. Surely, if there had ever been an exception to that rule, it was Lucy Gray Baird, a person who defied easy definition, a rare bird just like him. It's clear that Snow sees district people differently, and that's something that the prequel movie wasn't able to fully explain. To be honest, I think they made Snow more likable in some way compared to the book, because when reading the book, I took down many moments that made me pause because he was such a jerk to people. He was not that likable, but I guess it looks different in the film because we're not really hearing Snow's monologue like in the book. His monologues were just twisted sometimes, and you can't really see all of that in a movie. Number 6. Snow was the youngest person to pass the Peacekeeper test. In Act 3 of the Ballad of the Songbirds and Snakes, Snow was sent to District 12 as a Peacekeeper. There, he enjoyed training and tests, and he actually excelled in all of it so much. It does make sense though because Snow was a top student in the academy, and the movie even points out how he got amazing marks because a lot of the recruits didn't know how to read, but he did. Ultimately, Snow was the youngest person to ever pass a Peacekeeper test according to the books. Number 5. Snow's name origin. Snow's full name was Coriolanus Snow, and Suzanne named him Coriolanus after the Shakespearean tragedy, well, you guessed it, Coriolanus. This tragedy talks about the Roman leader Gnaeus Marcius Coriolanus. Like Coriolanus Snow, Gnaeus Coriolanus hated the lower class or the district people, and he was killed later on. The name Snow, on the other hand, was chosen because of Corio's cold and icy demeanor. Number 4. Snow had a drunk hookup. I did not hear this fact at all in the prequel movie, but I get it. There was no appropriate place to add it in the movie, so it's pretty much forgotten by a lot of fans. Snow mentions this only once in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snake book, and here's the background. Lucy Gray and Snow just had their first kiss in the book, and Snow goes home. He thinks to himself that he never had any romantic relationships before and had barely any experience with girls because he couldn't risk anybody finding out about the truth of his family's poverty. As he thinks about this more, Snow remembers a pretty disturbing moment, and I'll just read it to you guys. There had been that one thing last year in the alley behind the train station, but that wasn't really a romance so as much as a dare Festus had put him up to. Between the Posca and the darkness, the memory was sketchy at best. On reflection, he had never even learned her name, but it had earned him the reputation of being rather a player. This made me so uncomfortable in the book. Like, dark alleyway, and he didn't even bother remembering the girl's name. Like, that's just horrible, but I guess it's canon. Snow did have a drunk hookup by the looks of it, even if he barely remembered it. Number 3. Snow may have married Livia Cardew. One of the most famous Snow quotes we got from the Hunger Games is,
"It's the things we love most that destroy us."
Snow, of course, learned this in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes when he fell in love with Lucy Gray Baird. Lucy Gray ended up turning on Snow, and it's still a mystery on what really happened to her. After their fallout, Snow realizes that love was a weakness and that he would never let anybody get to him like that again. However, in the Hunger Games trilogy, we see that Snow has a granddaughter, and that could only happen if Snow had a wife. There were many speculations on who Snow could have married, and in the last bit of the Ballad of the Songbirds and Snakes book, Snow mentions his classmate Livia Cardew as a possible wife. This actually shocked me when I read it, because Livia used to bully Snow and was openly rude to him a lot of times. She was also a pretty stuck-up capital citizen, but Snow considered her as a wife. This kind of makes sense though, because Snow wanted someone he will never fall in love with, but wanted a marriage for heirs or a power statement. So even if it's not confirmed that Snow married Livia, the possibility was clear in the book. Number 2. Snow and Sejanus were not friends. A common misconception I see online is how some people think that Snow and Sejanus were friends in the academy, but this is not really the case. I can't really blame them though, because it's, again, pretty hard to show Snow's internal thoughts. Snow and Sejanus are often mistaken as friends because Snow does go through great lengths to defend Sejanus until he decided to rat Sejanus out in Act 3. Their relationship was much more complicated, however, in the book. In the book, it's clear that Snow thinks of Sejanus as a lowly district kid who managed to get into the capital because of money, and Snow actually dislikes Sejanus a lot of times even before the betrayal. Snow thinks that Sejanus was such a spoiled brat who was somehow richer than the Snows, but he didn't really bully Sejanus like the rest of the academy students. In fact, Snow chose to ignore Sejanus, but Sejanus took this as a hint that Snow wasn't mean like the rest of the academy students. Sejanus thought that Snow was his friend, but Snow just felt bad for Sejanus a few times, which is why he tried to help Sejanus in some way, but they didn't really have a genuine friendship. When Sejanus died, Snow actually cried, but not fully because of grief. He was mainly crying because he was worried that people would realize his crimes eventually, since Snow ratted Sejanus out to Dr. Gaul. So ultimately, Sejanus did think Snow was his friend, but Snow did not really feel the same way. And last but not least is number 1. Snow used Lucy Gray for fame and didn't think she could win. Snow and Lucy Gray's relationship is complicated in both the book and the movie. The book had more of an upper hand and explained their relationship because we got Snow's thoughts all throughout, and we realized that Snow always saw Lucy Gray as his tribute and therefore his property. So I'll give you guys moments of this. By the end of chapter 10 in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes book, Snow realizes that Lucy Gray had just saved his life and therefore he owed her. Snow asked what he could do for her, and Lucy Gray said, "You could start by thinking I can actually win." Lucy Gray pretty much saw through Snow because chapters before, Snow already knew that there was a low chance for Lucy Gray to survive. Because of this, he knew that the only way he could help his grade up was to make Lucy Gray popular and well loved by the public so that he can get the sponsors and recognition. This is pretty evident in chapter 11 when Snow admits that what Lucy Gray said is true. He never considered Lucy Gray as the victor of the games. In his words, he had only wished that her charm and appeal would rub off on him and make him a success. Even his encouragement to sing for sponsors was an attempt to prolong the attention she brought him. Only a moment ago, her healed hands were good news because she could use them to play the guitar on interview night, not to defend herself from an attack in the arena. The fact that she mattered to him, as he claimed in the zoo, only made things worse. He should have been trying to preserve her life, to help her become the victor no matter the odds. So, ultimately, Snow is pretty self-aware enough to slightly admit that he was using her for the fame and recognition, but he did end up trying to help her win, even if it was through cheating. Snow did care in the end, but at first, he wanted to use her because being her mentor was his last project before his graduation. One last quote to really solidify my point is when he describes Lucy Gray again. He thinks to himself that she'll be dead in days, and this is his thought process. Here, in the relative privacy of the corner, he realized for the first time that she would be dead in a few days. Well, of course, he'd always known that. But he had thought about her more as his contender, his filly in a race, his dog in a fight. The more he had treated her as something special, the more she'd become human. That last part also solidifies how he thinks district citizens are less human compared to the capital citizens, and it really shows how messed up Snow's perceptions were because of his upbringing. And those are all the facts I have for this video. So how about you? What do you think of Coriolanus Snow? Let me know in the comments down below.